Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here for a second time with Dr. Ann Pisor. She is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Washington State University. And today we're going to talk about somewhat of a different topic. We're going to talk about field work, how anthropologists prepare for it, some of the complications that might arise while they're there, and stuff like that. So, Dr. Pisor, welcome to the show again. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me.
So, I guess we should start at the beginning. So, how do you plan field work actually? So, I mean, I guess that we should follow the order of things here. And I mean, basically, how do you plan? How do you come up with the idea of doing field work? How do you choose a particular community? How do you connect to that community? So let's start with that.
All the things, yeah. So for starters, so anthropologists can do field work, but so can other folks too. So increasingly we'll see psychologists, sociologists make it their way to the field, folks working in conservation. So field work is something that can unite many of us working with humans across different disciplines. Okay, so one thing, you might have seen this, Ricardo, in my notes. I'd like to start with talking a little bit about why to do field research in the first place, which I think is a bit of part of your question. So if we want to understand human nature, for example, we need to understand human diversity. And that's increasingly been a focus in disciplines like psychology, for example. So we want to understand things like, are there universals in human behavior? How do they vary across context? How are they affected by culture? How does social organization change in different contexts? And all of these can give us insight into human behavior and into 21st century issues that we face, right? Things I'm interested in, like climate change or natural resource management. And so what we really focus on, if you're familiar with the sciences, is we focus on ecological validity and on external validity. So we're really interested in how behavior plays out in the real world. And we're interested in whether the kinds of questions we ask, for example, in laboratories or on surveys, actually make sense to folks living in different places and how much we can generalize. So that might be why you're interested in field work. But then the question comes, how do you get started, to your question, Ricardo, right?
Yeah.
So there's a few ways to do it. So one may be, for example, that you're already from a community where you'd like to go back and do research. And so some folks will actually work in communities where they're from. And so if that's the case, right, you already know where to go, you know your priorities. For other people, right, we have different things we might be thinking about. So for example, you might be considering where the most appropriate place to answer a research question would be. So if you're asking a question about foraging, you might want to work with a population who's still doing foraging. Alternatively, you may also collaborate with a community you already know, or that someone you knows, if that makes sense. So for example, I started out working at my advisor, Michael Gervin's field site when I got started. And so that enabled me to actually have an entree, a place to begin in field research. So if one's actually working with a community you already know or that you're from, you may end up doing collaborative research. And so collaborative research involves actually choosing research questions with the community themselves, having those conversations, and prioritizing what the community is interested in. And so if you're doing that, then oftentimes the research question and where you ask it is determined by what community members are prioritizing. Alternatively, right, you may actually bring the question to the community afterwards, something you're interested in, and get a sense of whether or not they would like to participate. So once you've done all those things, right, first you've got the connection, maybe you're from the place, maybe it's some place that you're just getting acquainted with. You go through the process of getting permissions. I should say that if you're a field researcher, for those of you out there who are or who are considering it, you know that there are a lot of different skill sets involved. So you'll see these kind of come out as I'm talking about the answers to these different questions. So getting permissions is requires a skill set that includes a lot of patience, and includes a lot of social skills, I think, at the end of the day. So for starters, you usually, as a field researcher, consult with the community where you want to go do research. This can involve, for example, starting with local authorities. Oftentimes they're the gatekeepers, they're the ones you go to and talk to first. You may also then go to a community meeting and consult with community members about the research that you'd like to do. So this can take time. Sometimes communities actually want the time to reflect on the research question you've posed and decide whether they want to participate. You may need to go through institutional review boards. This is true for most researchers. So for those of you who aren't familiar, institutional review boards usually exist in universities. Sometimes countries have them as well. And what they'll do is they'll review your research to make sure that it complies with international standards and national standards on human subjects and human participant treatment, right? So the kinds of questions you're asking, whether you're protecting people's rights, their right to say no, for example, and whether your research has net positive effects on the world or on society. So are there more benefits than costs of doing that research? So go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, by the way, in regards to that, you also have to take into account if the community we're talking about lives in a protected area or not, right?
That's right.
Because I would imagine that in order for you to get into a protected area, it would involve more steps than just get into an area where, for example, a tribe lives that's not protected, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I'll use this pause to actually give an example from my research. So I've done most of my fieldwork in Bolivia. And in Bolivia, whether or not you're working with a pueblo indígena, so that would be roughly equivalent to an indigenous group or First Nations group, for those of you familiar with those terms. What is often involved is that you actually go through the tribal government itself before you talk to the community. And so that would be the first place to start. That's also true for folks who are collaborating with tribes in the US or in Canada. You go to the tribe first before going to the community. And so that's one layer. Another layer may be if you're collaborating with a community who is in, as you say, a protected area. They may be part of a nature preserve, for example. And in that case, you actually additionally need sometimes permission from the actual park itself, in addition to the community. And so there can be lots of layers here. That said, if you're working, for example, like my graduate student, Ollie Shannon, is working in the US in cities, you don't necessarily need to go to the city government to get permission to do research, right? So it depends a lot on context, but there can be multiple layers.
Okay, so another question before we continue, because I want this interview to be also for the general public, not just, for example, anthropology students or academics or whoever. But when we talk about communities here, I mean, what the community might mean is not just people that are part of societies that are not your own, right? I mean, it might be an immigrant community, for example, or a particular subculture, a particular group of people that is part of a subculture that lives in your own country, your own, I don't know, territory, or your own society, even, of course, that might get us into some more complicated questions of what really is a society and what distinguishes between different societies. But anyway, that's true, right?
It is true. Yeah, exactly. You can work in your own town as an anthropologist, right? You don't necessarily have to go anywhere. That can be hard in its own way because you often have to take a step back and really try to understand the community you live in a new way. But yes, the word community can apply not only to some place like a town or a city. That can be easier in terms of getting permissions, figuring out where to work because it's bounded. But additionally, it can refer to people who live across a large area who have a similar identity. And for folks who are, for example, from immigrant communities, from diasporas, that is folks who are from one place who live all over the world, those can also be communities of study. And so anthropologists and field researchers will often find themselves working internationally, but also sometimes in their own country as well.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was an important question to ask because particularly for the folks who are not familiarized with anthropology, they might think that, I mean, if you're an anthropologist, you study tribes, foragers, I mean, traditional societies, generally speaking, but that might not be the case. Communities involve much more than that.
Much more than that, that's right. Yeah, so even though we often think about anthropology as being someplace where we go to exotic other lands, and it's very romantic, and those kinds of misconceptions sometimes can do a disservice both to the people and to the anthropologists, because a lot of times we work in our own backyards. And that's important too, because as we come to, as we say, decolonize anthropology, as we actually involve folks who are from communities of study, that means that sometimes we have to recognize that anthropologists actually work where they're from, and not only in places foreign to them.
And that might also include your own society, right? I
That's
mean,
right.
anthropology is the study of humans. So you can
The
also
study of
study
humans.
you can also study American society, for example, if you want.
Yep, wherever there are humans or non-human primate analogies, for example, or other animals who can give us insight into humans, that's where you'll find an anthropologist. So we're all over the place studying all the different people living in different parts of the world.
Right. So I think we were at getting permissions, right?
Absolutely, yes. And thank you for stopping me. I appreciate it. Yeah, so getting permissions really depends on who you're working with. If you are, for example, social scientists have done this. If you're studying the scientists who are working in Antarctica, right? Those have been studied by social scientists. You need to get permissions from the US National Science Foundation, from the scientists working down in Antarctica, right? Those would be the places where you would get permission. If you're in Bolivia, for example, as I mentioned, you need permission from the country itself. You also need permission from the Pueblo Indígena if you're working with an indigenous group, and then the community itself. So there's multiple layers of permission. Those may or may not involve, as I mentioned, the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. So what those boards do is they take a look at your research, sometimes even at your research questions, and make sure that those actually are appropriate, that they can protect the anonymity and the rights of the people who are being asked these questions as well. And so you may encounter IRBs at the government level. For example, Tanzania has its own IRB that we go through when we work in Tanzania. You may also encounter it at the community level. A lot of tribes in the US, for example, have their own IRBs.
And I mean, the questions here being appropriate means that they are both scientifically relevant, but also ethical, right?
That's right. And so they need to not, for example, ask for identifying information and not protect that information, or ask for identifying information that isn't really crucial to the study itself. So, for example, in the US, a concern for a lot of tribes, First Nations groups in Canada, include things like genetic information. So scientists in the past have collected a lot of genetic information and then done studies on that information without the tribe's consent. And so tribes, therefore, are pretty concerned, and rightly so, about what the information is being used for when it is collected. So we as researchers have to be very clear about the aims of our research and why we are collecting the data we are collecting, just so that not only the tribe, but the participants themselves are giving fully informed consent about what they are actually agreeing to.
By the way, perhaps I should ask these. I mean, afterwards, after we talk a little bit more about how you integrate into the community. But I mean, but since this is a very relevant question in anthropology, I mean, when you're studying societies that supposedly, particularly the ones that supposedly represent the ones in which we evolved, that are closer to the ones in which we evolved, like foragers and other traditional societies, there's that question about, I mean, if they've already been influenced somewhat by by people from industrialized or post-industrial societies and so on. So, I mean, since anthropologists have been in touch with many different traditional societies across the globe for probably hundreds of years now, I mean, when you go into one of those communities and you're getting permission to do field work, is it the case that some of the people there already know about some of the scientific work that's been done on them?
That's definitely the case, and increasingly so. So, as you mentioned, anthropologists have been doing research with a lot of different societies, not all of them. There are some societies, for example, in Brazil, who still are not in regular contact with other people, right? And so
by
are
the way,
protected. But go ahead.
Are there any societies that we can say are really isolated?
So isolated is a good choice of words. So uncontacted is not really the case. So even folks, for example, being protected in Brazil, you often hear about them, for example, through Survival International, which is an international organization. Those folks have been in contact with people in the past, but have chosen not to continue that contact. And oftentimes they're in contact with other indigenous groups in the area, but just not, for example, the Brazilian government or with other Brazilian citizens. And so those tribes are isolated, absolutely, but not uncontacted. There aren't very many left. I don't have the number top of my mind right now, but there are very few left. A lot of the ones studied by anthropologists have actually been in contact with other peoples for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years in the past. But oftentimes we act as if they're not, that they have not had that contact. But it is true that they often have. So the San, for example, sometimes you hear them called the Bushmen. You might hear about the Kung, for example. They are one group within the San. The San actually now review research themselves as well to make sure that it actually benefits the San community before they give permission for people to come. So increasingly, you'll see even hunter-gatherer groups or former hunter-gatherer groups that anthropologists have typically worked with are now also actually doing their own human subjects reviews as well, reviewing research before they decide whether or not to participate.
That's very interesting. By the way, do you have anthropologists that are originally from those communities? And from those, I'm talking specifically traditional society, about traditional societies.
Yes, so I'll start with the most familiar for me. I'm here based in the US, as everyone knows. And so you do see anthropologists from tribes and First Nations groups here in the US and in Canada, for example. So that's quite common. For a lot of the societies that we often talk about, say, as evolutionary anthropologists that we're really interested in, like the Hadza, like the San, like the Tsimane, what you actually see a lot of is researchers involved in those projects. You might see them listed as co-authors on studies that are not yet, they don't yet have their PhDs. That said, we do see folks, for example, coming from the Hadza and from the Tsimane who are lawyers and who are then able to actually review the research being done with an eye to the law. And so you see the involvement of communities that we've been collaborating with as anthropologists at all sorts of different levels, both in the production of research, but also in the review of that research.
Yeah, no, because I asked you that because I would imagine that having someone who is originally from any of those communities would make your work easier, right?
Easier and different, yeah. So involving co-authors from communities, first of all, adds to actual equity in science, right? Because then we're actually involving the communities themselves. So it reduces that kind of colonial history that anthropology has had. Yeah. Additionally, it brings really new perspectives. So as you know, many people who are listening to this will know, there's been conversations about how involvement of folks with different backgrounds has changed science because it changes the way we ask questions. And that is also extremely true in field research. So if you actually have a field project run by someone from a community where they're doing their research or who's part of that team, the research questions you ask will be different and often more relevant to community members than if it's something coming from outside, right? So community members know what questions to ask and how to ask them in ways that anthropologists who are not from those communities often do not.
I mean, because there's always linguistic and cultural barriers, right? Even someone
Exactly.
who, even if you go into a community and you learn their language, there's always subtleties in the ways, perhaps certain, about the meanings of certain words that are connected to certain practices, rituals, behaviors, and whatever that someone from the community probably understands much better than someone who just gets integrated into it, right?
Mm-hmm. It's true. And what's interesting here is sometimes it's helpful to have both. So you mentioned someone who's integrated into the community. So for example, my field research has been done with communities that are not my own. So I had to learn how to negotiate life in those communities. In some ways, that can be really beneficial. And this has traditionally been the view of anthropology, is that when you are a stranger in a community, you know what to look for. You know what looks different. You are more attuned to the nuances of things. And that is true. But if you're from that community, you also better know how to your point, ask those questions, right? You know the language, you know the norms, you know how to maneuver in those communities pretty well. And so you can do different work, right? You can do work that's more attuned to the nuances than maybe an outsider can do as they're just learning how to be a part of that community. And so sometimes the most powerful field research is done by a team that involves people both from the community and not. And here's the thing, too. So if you look at anthropological research from the past, even if community members weren't listed as co-authors, you almost always see a community member involved somewhere, checking the translation, checking the questions, helping with the interviews, right, doing on-the-spot translation. And so anthropologists have really been reliant on community members for a long time. What we're increasingly seeing now within anthropology is actually recognizing those community members by making them part of the team, by seeing teams led by community members in the first place, and by doing more and more collaborative research.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps one of the limitations that people who were born and raised in a particular community would have when it comes to scientific work is that, I mean, perhaps it's harder for those people to distance themselves from their own cultural conditioning to view things less in a less biased way, let's say. And of course, I'm not saying that that's worse for people who are part of traditional societies. That would happen equally for any people from any society. That also happens to Portuguese people, to American people, and their own culture, right? So.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so doing field research is challenging, but it's challenging for different reasons for people who are from the communities they're studying, right? If you're Portuguese and studying Portugal, for example, or in the US studying the US. And it's also difficult if you're studying a different community, but for different reasons. If you're studying that different community, you have a lot to learn. And that integration, as we'll talk about, can be challenging. But if you're studying your own community, taking that step back can also be challenging. Another thing that's often challenging for members of communities when they're doing field research there is that sometimes it can be hard for people to distinguish when you are in researcher mode and when you are not. So can someone have a conversation with you about their family as they would when you're their friend if you are also currently doing research in that community? Are people worried about whether or not their trust in you will be violated, right, by the fact that you're doing field research? And so sometimes for people who are working in the communities they're from and doing field research in those communities, they just have to be extra clear. I am currently in researcher mode. I am currently in friend mode, and just telling the people they're interacting with which mode they're in to actually avoid some of the complications and awkwardness that can come with that.
Yeah. I mean, of course, this is just anecdotal, but if it's true, it's, I guess, a good illustration of how people might be biased when it comes to their own society. Because, I mean, you might hear people particularly in more industrialized societies, people who live in actual countries, let's say the more nationalistic or patriotic ones, saying things like, my country is the best, my culture is the best, wherever. But at the same time, it's you also often hear people saying that the people from their own countries are the most stupid in the world. And I mean, that's basically impossible. It's impossible that the Portuguese, the German, the Japanese, the American people are all the most stupid out there, but because you get most in touch with your own people, it's easier for you to exaggerate both the positives and the negatives, I guess.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that traditionally we're trained to do in anthropology, especially if we're working in ethnography, right? So if we're actually trying to write down our experiences and what culture is like or what a particular practice is like in a certain place where we're doing research, we're taught to be reflexive. And that is that our personality, our biases, who we are, right, and our relationship to the community, power dynamics, right, things like that, play into the kinds of data that we get. And so we have to be aware that we're coming with biases. If we're working in our own communities, we have biases. If we're working in a different community, we still have those biases, right? They're just operating in different ways. And so to actually say, to take that step back and say, I recognize that I am a very patriotic person, or I very much disagree with the politics of my community, and how that might actually affect the data one gets, the quality of the science that's done. And sometimes that can be positive or negative, right? That may mean that some folks connect with you and say, I too am very patriotic. Let's talk about that. Other folks might be turned off from that. And that's something I think we'll get into here a little bit later, is how much of yourself to bring to field work, including those biases, and how that can be challenging in different ways if you're working in your own community versus a different one. How are those biases going to be playing out?
Yeah, and this is another question that we might get into later in the interview, but just to comment briefly on it, I would imagine that particularly when the culture you're studying is, at least in certain practices, is very different from your own original culture. There might also be certain instances where some moral issues might come to the table, right? Perhaps there are certain things that for you are already a little bit on the extreme side of things. And of course, you have to try to be as objective as you can and try to see it from their own point of view, but it might be complicated, right?
It can be complicated, and field researchers differ in the degree to which they're willing to set aside their own ethical and moral compass as they're doing research, in the sense that they may see or hear something that they feel like they actually have to step in. But sometimes as a field researcher, myself included, actually hearing the things coming from other people as you're doing that research can be challenging. I've studied a lot of intergroup relationships in the past, and sometimes you hear very racist things, for example, and it's a question to you as a researcher. Do you react? Do you say something? Do you try to correct what someone is saying, or do you just listen? And there's no right or wrong answer to that, but it will affect your relationship with the person you're interviewing. It'll affect the data that you get, and it could actually also affect your relationship with the community. So there's all these different layers, and sometimes it can be pretty complicated to be an anthropologist, especially when you're dealing with ethics.
Okay, so we'll come back to that later on in the interview, but then, so how do you then prepare for the field work itself after you've gone through all of the permissions and all of that?
Yeah, there's still, unfortunately, a lot to do. So what you will often find for field researchers, just so everyone knows, is that we actually do cram this all into just a couple of months before we go to the field, but it's a very busy few months. So here are some of the things that are involved. I should mention that I actually teach an entire class on this very topic, so doing field research in anthropology, what that looks like. And so I'm going to squeeze a lot of whole seminar discussion, a whole week's worth of seminar discussion into this one answer here.
Yeah,
So
but that's just to say that that's because I picked you as the victim for this kind of episode.
Yes, yeah, it so happens I have a lot of information on this, but I'm going to pick just the highlights. What I want everyone to know is that there's more to it, but these are some of the basic things to be aware of as you're going into the final stretch of prepping for field research. Yeah. So you know where you're going, you have your permissions, you've talked to the community. Yeah. What are the last few steps you need to do? Mm-hmm. So it can help to get pointers from someone who's lived there if you're going to a community that you haven't been a part of in the past. That can be helpful. You can find that online if you don't know someone who's been there before. Just Google, see what you can find. And then there are some logistical things you need to anticipate. So if you are working in a place that is remote, this may be, for example, in a remote part of the country you live in the US, for example, you can work pretty rurally. Additionally, you might work in a rural place, say in Bolivia, as I've done in the past. You have to have a couple things ready. You need an emergency contact that can keep a level head. So if your parents cannot stay calm, for example, or your spouse cannot stay calm under stressful situations if something has happened, then you need to have someone else who can do that. So who are your emergency contacts? Who are you going to check in with every week and say, here's where I am, if you hopefully have cell phone service, and here's who I'm staying with. You might want to consider having insurance, so international health insurance or evacuation insurance. These are the bad things, right? So I'll start with the little negatives here. But then there's some interesting other logistics to consider. So if there's no electricity, how are you going to get that? Do you need to bring a solar panel, for example? How are you going to get to the location you're going? If you are working in a city, it might be as simple as driving there. If you're working rurally, you may need, for example, to rent a vehicle or have someone drive you there. You also need to think about what you want from home to bring with you. And this is really important for mental health. So if you are working in a community other than your own, you may experience culture shock. We'll talk about the signs of culture shock later and how to be prepared for it and what to do when it happens. But some things you can do to kind of anticipate that is to bring some of your favorite stuff. So for me, that's a Kindle, a bunch of downloaded TV shows. Now in the communities I've collaborated with, they have lots of good data connections, so I can also scroll the internet. But things that can keep you connected to your home culture so that you still have those moments of escape if you're feeling really overwhelmed.
Yeah, by the way, about that, what if you don't have access to electricity?
Yeah, so what if? So I can answer that question multiple ways. So tell me, how do you mean?
I mean, for example, I might imagine that also to take notes and to collect data, it would be useful to bring with you a PC, right? A computer.
Yes.
And also you mentioned the Kindle, so that also involves electricity. You might also have your cell phone, your smartphone, whatever. So, yep. But what if it just so happens that the community you're going to study lives in a place where there's no electricity around?
Yeah. So the way we often deal with this is we will bring a solar panel, and then we will bring a battery to charge with that solar panel. So you can charge a car battery, for example. You can also buy from different companies now in the US what we call wet batteries. So they're not car batteries, but they can hold a solar charge. And then you use that battery to charge your devices. So if you are working rurally, usually you're a little bit more conservative with electricity than you would be otherwise. So a Kindle doesn't take much electricity, which is nice. On the other hand, a PC takes a ton. And so if you're having to make a choice between what to charge, you might want to charge a device that takes less power. Now, part of your question here is additionally, how are you collecting data? So I prefer to collect data electronically. So I like to collect it on either a tablet or on a smartphone. The reason I like to do that is that I then have it entered already. So I don't have the process later of where I have a sheet of paper and then I have to have myself or someone else type it into a computer. So it saves time. Yeah. Additionally, it's already in the format you need to maybe do analyses, which can be really nice. On the negative side, that does mean that if something happens to your electronic device, or if you don't have good sunshine that day and you can't charge your solar battery, that means you will not be able to collect electronic data. So what I do is I always have a backup. I bring a voice recorder. And so if my phone crashes or runs out of battery, I continue the interview with a backup piece of paper, and I have a little voice recorder that records the interview, and then I can later take notes by listening back to it. So if you don't have a lot of electricity, you can do it. Solar panel and solar battery is the way that most people do. And then if they're collecting electronic data, we tend to use devices that use less electricity than like a PC to get those data.
Okay, so I'm thinking about the worst case scenario. What if you're going to study the Inuit in northern Canada and it's like winter?
Yeah, it's very cold up there. I have collaborators who work in that
you
region.
probably also won't have enough sunlight.
Yeah, interesting question. Depends on the time of year, right?
Yeah.
Additionally, I believe most communities that my collaborators work with, who work with the Inuit, have electricity as well. So it's not too much of an issue. If that's the case, you can work off of a car battery for a while before it's recharged. So that's one option. In places that have inconsistent access to electricity, the infrastructure isn't great for electricity in a lot of different parts of the world. You actually then store up into, say, maybe one of those little batteries you can buy on Amazon that can recharge a phone a few times. Sometimes I'll do that in the field, so just have that ready. That way, if I am working in a community that has electricity but it fails, I still have a battery backup that's small but usable. So there's a number of different ways to do it. Can you do field research with absolutely zero electricity? Yes, and it's been done many times before by many people. But at that point, if you start to, you don't have a big enough battery, for example, or you don't think you'll have electricity sometime in the future, paper and pencil research. Go back to the basics.
Yeah, I mean, of course, nowadays you have all of that, but I would imagine that even a few decades ago, where you wouldn't have any PCs, any cell phones, none of that, I mean, it would be, at least in some cases, a real adventure, right?
A real adventure is a good way to put it, yes. Some folks say that that's the real anthropology before we had all these cushy things. But yeah, that's right. So you have no electricity. You maybe have some batteries for your flashlights or for a radio, but you would not have all of the fancy things we have today.
Okay, so one specific thing, because I'm not sure to what extent this might be a complication or not. What about food?
So food depends on where you're headed. So I'll take the example of the chamane, for example, where I've done field research in the past. So we will often bring food with us when we go into communities with the chamane for a couple of reasons. So one reason is to feed ourselves, right? So we might bring out things like rice or pasta, things we can use to make dinner. But additionally, we will also bring out food in case people need it. So if some families are having a hard time. Additionally, we'll bring out food for trade. So for example, with the chamane, you may have someone who brought home some fish or went hunting, and then we can trade food for access to fish or for hunted meats. And so the food is something that can be really important. And if you're working with people who practice subsistence, that is, who are growing or hunting a lot of their own food or fishing a lot of their own food, then you can actually be part of that subsistence economy just by virtue of living in the community. So you have to be prepared for trading and for sharing in the kinds of way you would if you were always part of that community.
So
go ahead. Yeah.
That also raises an interesting question. So when it comes to trading, is it that you can just bring with you any kind of food, or does it have to be specific foods that those people accept to trade with?
Usually you want to bring the kind of food people want. And that's because that's what community members are looking for and hoping for. It can be interesting, again, coming back to ethics. So one of the things that folks often want in Bolivia, not just the chamane, but in general, is cooking oil. And so you might think to yourself, well, cooking oil isn't particularly healthy, or maybe people want sugar. And you're thinking, well, so the anthropologists are bringing in sugar. And it becomes an interesting kind of ethical consideration for anthropologists. Do I bring what people want, even if I know that maybe bringing it to the community isn't necessarily a good thing for people's health?
And
Or
I
do I
think,
bring what I think is better, right, or
and
healthier? And what
also
do
I
I
would
do?
imagine that that would be even more dramatic if we're talking about a community where people are particularly predisposed to certain diseases like
Mm,
diabetes, for example.
that's right. And these are the kinds of considerations we have to make on a regular basis. Now, I will say that, so for example, like communities like the Chimane, people are buying sugar and oil anyway, right?
Mm.
But it does mean that the question is, do you continue that? Do you bring more yourself and engage in that kind of trading or that kind of gifting as well when you're giving away things like oil and sugar? So to answer your question, it depends. A lot of anthropologists bring what community members want. What that means in practice is something that we regularly have to think about in terms of ethics.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, talking about food in general, then it depends, right? I mean,
It depends.
both for yourself and for other people of the community.
That's right. So, for example, so I've worked with three different populations in Bolivia. So the Chimane, the Mosaten, and a community that I just call the Interculturales for short, so meaning multicultural. And the Chimane, for example, I would bring all my food with me, right? Most of what I would eat. There would be some I would obtain from trading, but most of it I would be bringing in myself, either by car if there was road access or by boat for communities where there's no road. It's different for the Mosaten, for example. So there's road access and there are small shops in the community. So I will bring in some food with me from the local town, but a lot of other foods, things like onions, pasta, chicken for dinner tonight, I can buy within the community. And so I need to bring less with me. And there's also less food sharing because there's more of a market economy and people are buying more of their own food.
Yes, yeah, about food sharing, because I had that in mind, I would like to ask you, so to what extent do people, if you get integrated into their community, share food with you, and how careful should you be about that?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, I guess that you understand what I'm asking here, right? It's not that I'm just disparaging the foods that other people's cook. It's just that, I mean, sometimes perhaps the way they do it might not be the most secure way, let's say, you might,
Mm.
right?
For health, for example, for
Yeah,
my health as a
for
researcher.
health
Mhm.
issues, yeah.
Yeah. Another complicated question. So I will just mention at this point, I was thinking about saving it till the end, but many of these pointers come from a relatively large book by Russ Bernard, basically a field guide to anthropology. Let me make sure I get the title exactly right here. So
Yeah,
Research Methods in Anthropology.
I will see
Mhm.
if I can remember to include that in the notes, in the description of the interview.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a really good book. I assign it to my students. So again, Research Methods in Anthropology by Russell Bernard is a book that we've been using for a long time for field training. The reason I mention it here is he has a whole discussion on what to do about if someone offering you a beverage that hasn't been boiled. In a lot of
Yeah.
parts of the world, if you're drinking unboiled water, you can come down with something like giardia, which from personal experience, I will tell you is quite unpleasant. Um, and the question is whether you accept the drink. So anthropologists cannot agree on this, right?
Mm.
So Russ Bernard says you probably shouldn't accept the drink. Other anthropologists say do it, right? I have a technique where sometimes I will just take a sip, but I'll keep my lips closed if I'm really worried about the drink, and then I'll put it back down so I haven't actually swallowed anything. So there's different ways people will deal with the drink question, right? Whether you're
Also,
drinking unboiled water.
yeah,
Hmm.
because that if you don't accept it, it might raise other kinds of complications, right? They might
That's
feel
right.
offended or something like
That's
that.
right. So this may be the reason why maybe this is too much information for everybody. That I've had Giardia 3 times, I think, maybe four if I'm losing count now, because sometimes I feel like it would be rude to say no, particularly if someone's made homemade beer in Bolivia that can take days to make, sometimes weeks if you're really letting it ferment. And so people expect you to drink it, and that's part of the culture, and that's what you do, and you pass it around. So you'll have a cup or a gourd, you'll take a drink and then pass it to the next person. So you're all sharing saliva and you're all drinking something that hasn't been boiled. So there's etiquette. So you are offered something to drink or to eat. And the question becomes, how do you weigh your own safety or how you're going to feel in a few days if you do get sick versus whether or not that is not very friendly or not good form to actually say no. And anthropologists differ on this. So if you already have a good relationship with the community or the person who's offering, maybe you have more ability to say no. But something to keep in mind is that if you're in a place where there are norms of hospitality, where someone invites you to eat when you come, yeah. If you're already full, you should still say yes, and you should try to eat as much as you can, right? Which can be hard. It also means you might put on a lot of weight in the field, right? So I put on a good 10 pounds when I was there for 9 months in 2014 and 2015 from saying yes, right? But that's often because you might notice the more you learn about a place, people are actually bringing you the best cut of meat, or they're bringing you something that they normally don't eat in their household because it's too expensive, but they bring it to you because you're a guest. And so if that's the case, you should eat it. Personal opinion, right? But you should eat it. And that gesture is important. It is important to them to make the gesture and important to you for you to accept. So yeah, to your question, sometimes you're putting yourself in harm's way. Again, I leave it up to the researcher about whether they decide to do this or not, and you have to make situation by situation decisions. Sometimes I will close my lips, sometimes I will open them, depending, like when I'm drinking, depending on what's being offered and how important it is. But those are risks that you can or cannot take as a field researcher.
Also, because earlier I mentioned it being safe or not, but I mean, what safe might mean depends on the situation, right? Because it's not just you sharing saliva with other people or the water not being boiled. It can just be the case that that kind of food is safe for those people because they lived in those conditions and they've been consuming particular kinds of foods for a long time, but because you come from America or whatever, I mean, your immune system or any other aspect of your digestive system or whatever might not deal with that food in a good way, right?
Yeah. And that's something that some researchers will say. So Russ Bernard, for example, says that he will say, I have a weak stomach, or I have a, in my case, I'd say like a gringa stomach, my stomach isn't accustomed to these kinds of things, and I could use that to politely say no. In some contexts that works, in other contexts that still will be offensive, but that's something that a researcher might have to do. And part of it is you just have to know your own stomach. So if your stomach isn't as good with smoked meats that have been out for a week, then maybe you'll have to find a way to say no. It's a decision that we all have to make, but it does mean sometimes we're taking some risks. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we're already getting sort of into that topic, but how do you integrate into the community then?
Yeah. So if you're not from the community where you're doing field research, you have your work cut out for you. So some people who are listening and watching will have that experience where you've moved from one place to another and you have to make new friends and learn a new way of doing things, or maybe even learn a new language, and it's hard and it can be exhausting, and you can probably relate to this. So one of the first things that anthropologists will often encounter if they are working in a new place is that people will actually think that you're pretty silly, that you are like a child. So these things will come up. You're like a child, or like a clown, or you're very ridiculous. How could you not possibly know something, right? How could you not know the way to do this thing?
Yeah, because I mean, it's normal for people to assume that you should know those things because they know it, they know them, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's like when someone moves into your community from somewhere else. I'm sure most people have experienced this, sure. And you're puzzled by their behavior. You're wondering, how could they not know this thing? If you yourself, on the other hand, have done that before, then you know exactly how it works, right? You're confused. You don't quite know how the bureaucracy works or what you're supposed to say in a certain situation. It's like that for an anthropologist all the time, right?
And that's why, let me just say this before you continue, that's why in a multicultural world, anthropologists are so important, right?
As one of my colleagues put it the other day, we often are doing cultural translation.
Yeah.
So we're often the ones who are learning what it's like in a different place and then acting as a conduit. So in Bolivia, for example, I will often go and give lectures at the school about what things are like somewhere else. And I remind the students and the teachers that it's as we'll put it, like an intercambio, like the information is going both ways. So I learn about things in Bolivia and bring it back to the US and to researchers around the world through academic literature, but it's also going the other way. So folks are learning about what it's like to live where I live, even as I'm going to other places.
Yeah.
So that information sharing is really a nice feature. Go ahead, yeah.
No, I was going to say go ahead then with the integration.
Yeah, integration is fun. So if you are a person who has not as thick of a skin, let me say, so if you can be sensitive, as many of us are, the majority of us are, to someone making fun of you, to kids thinking you're very silly and laughing about you to your face, or calling you a clown or saying that you don't know anything. You have to kind of get used to doing field research. It was hard for me, right? It was hard to have people laugh at me a lot. And kind of cultivating that thick skin, getting used to just being silly can be important. And the reason for that is that if people think that you don't know anything, or if you even tell people, as I will now, I don't know anything, like, please tell me how it works, is you then learn about that. And so back to my original point at the top of this conversation, if you're trying to understand human nature through its diversity, you need to actually understand that diversity. And one of the ways that field researchers, especially anthropologists or sociologists, will do this is to do something called participant observation. So where we will actually try to get involved in the community in different things that people are doing in daily activities to understand how everything works. And that helps us both kind of capture what's going on, but also understand what kinds of questions to ask. Now, again, if you include someone from that community, that'll help a lot. You'll get better insight. But traditionally, this is how we framed it, right? That we would learn through participant observation how things are done. And so admitting that you know nothing and asking some questions, not too many, you don't want to annoy people, but some questions can really help you learn what it's like to live in that community and what is important for people. And that can really help guide the science that follows.
Also, I would imagine that even if you have a very thick skin and you're used to these kind of things, and even if you have some safety mechanisms at your disposal in case you mess things up and you have to ask for help, I would imagine that just because we are human and we evolved socially and we want to feel integrated into a particular community, even if just for survival reasons, then just being made fun of and bashed sometimes and stuff like that might be really hard sometimes.
It is. Yeah. I study human sociality. I'm a very social creature, and I, like everyone else who's probably listening, will feel it if people keep laughing at you, right?
Because evolutionarily speaking, it's scary, right?
You don't want to feel ostracized. You feel on the outs with the community. It's not a good sign. All those evolved emotions of ours kick in, and you may start to feel a little bit out of sorts. This is a good time for me to mention what came up earlier, and I want to talk about it a little bit more at length here, and that is culture shock. Mm-hmm. So culture shock is something that you experience when you are in a new place or when you return to a place that you haven't been for a while. So if you've been in the field and are coming back to where you spend most of your time, you might feel culture shock. And culture shock comes from where things are just very different and you feel out of sorts all the time, like you're on that fringe of the community. And again, to your point, Ricardo, about evolved emotions, we have these emotions kick in that are telling us something, right? Telling us that we're not fitting in or something's not right. Or it can really start to affect us. So some early symptoms of culture shock can include feelings of irritation, for example, or moral disgust, or even something like just being in different social interactions repeatedly and feeling like things are just off. So this can often manifest in loneliness. One of the most famous anthropologists from the past, Malinowski, he talked about it early in Argonauts of the Pacific, his really famous book, that he just disappeared in his tent for weeks reading books because he needed to get away and he needed to be alone. That kind of loneliness can be really overpowering for field researchers. So what we need to be aware of as field researchers with our mental health is for that not to cascade into depression. Feeling excluded from a community, as we know, right, can lead to feelings of depression, and that depression is telling us something. And so how do you deal with that as a field researcher? If you go with somebody else, it can help. There are pros and cons of doing field research in teams. One of the downsides is that you may not integrate as much to the community. One of the upsides is that it can be better for your mental health. So that's something to note. If you are by yourself, you can try to cultivate relationships with people locally that you feel you can share a little bit more with, where you are feeling more connected. That can help. And then additionally, a little escapism never hurt anyone. So reading those books, watching those terrible TV shows you brought with you, scrolling on Twitter to see what everybody else is up to, that can help you reconnect and remind yourself that you are not on the outs with all communities. You're just feeling a little bit disconnected from other humans right now, and that's okay. That's totally normal.
Mm-hmm. Also, because I mean, and with this, I have some personal experience. I mean, living in a small community because I grew up in a small village here in Portugal. And I mean, sometimes people, and I understand why people are worried about that, but sometimes people talk about loneliness in big cities because, I mean, most people are anonymous, and if you don't make friends, then it's really hard for you to feel connected to people in big cities. But on the other hand, if you live in a small community, you're being watched by everyone all the time. And I mean, it might be nice to feel connected to other people, but it's nice if you're in fact connected to them, because if you're not, it's really scary. So.
Yeah. There, as someone who has also lived in small communities in this country and in other countries and cities, there are definitely pros and cons, right? So it can be nice that everyone's watching you. I mean, if something happens, someone knows, they notice. On the other hand, that is a lot of social pressure, and it can be really hard on people in those small communities. But in the city, if you don't have those social connections, again, that loneliness kicks in. And so mental health and movement is really key. You can think about this when you encounter someone who has, for example, emigrated or immigrated to a place. Pay attention, right? I mean, how are they doing? Anthropologists are suffering the same thing. And so oftentimes we can relate to this kind of culture shock very well. What does it feel like to be in that new place and to feel completely cut off and just bewildered by how different everything is? And you have to take care of yourself. And if you aren't familiar with that, then sometimes you need someone else to help take care of you. So having that connection back home, that person you can call every week, if you're doing field research, can be the person who kind of anchors you as you're feeling all of these different feelings.
Yeah, and also when you live in a big city, you might get away with messing things up several times because most people there don't know you. But if you mess things up big time, even once in a small community, then I don't want to say the word here, but you're basically done sometime.
Yeah, you're in trouble. And this is something that's interesting too in terms of doing field research in rural communities. For those who do, again, you can do field research in cities, right? Is that one of the skills you'll learn as you learn norms. So you start to learn norms through doing this kind of integration, admitting you know nothing and seeing what other people are doing, is that you then have to kind of learn when to apologize and when you've done something wrong. So having connections that will tell you when you did something wrong and then knowing how to try to remedy it can be important. But sometimes, to your point, it takes a while for people to let that slide, to let that be part of the past. because small communities talk, and it can take a little while for things to blow over. Anthropologists make mistakes, but we have to often be ready to say that we're sorry, or ready to repair relationships if we do something wrong.
Yeah, but I mean, it depends on the mistake, but sometimes if it's a real grave mistake, then yeah, you might be done. You might be
You
done.
might be done. I don't want to scare people off from field research with this
Yeah,
conversation, right? But it does help to be upfront about some of these things, that there are some downsides. There are some risks we talked about. So it can be, sometimes you have to think about, if something happens, if you get appendicitis, right? Where are you going to go? What's your exit plan? You need to have someone in contact, particularly if you are a woman working by yourself. You need to have someone who knows where you are. And then additionally, it may be that every once in a while it just doesn't work. Maybe you
yeah,
make a mistake, or maybe a community doesn't have a lot of trust in researchers. A lot of communities that anthropologists work with, particularly in rural places or in other countries, have had negative experiences with either the country you're from. Being from the US, I run into this a lot, or have had negative experiences with researchers. And so sometimes it's just not going to work out. And knowing when to call it can be difficult. But as you said, sometimes you're just done.
yeah. And I mean, I also don't want to scare people away from doing field work specifically, nor living in a village or any small
Hmm.
community. I mean, if you get integrated, there's many options out there for you to deal
Hmm.
with people if you make a mistake, because you know how to do it properly. So it's no horror movie usually. But
Right.
yeah, it might get into one if you really mess things up big time. So
It's good to have someone who is familiar with the community, or at least with the larger context, who can
yeah,
help you. So for a lot of graduate students, that might be their advisor, for example, or someone in their program. But for other people who are engaging in field research, or who are getting training but don't have someone in their program who knows the community, it helps to find a trusted person. And this was a point I was going to come to, but
yeah,
one of the key things with integrating into communities is to make connections with a trusted family, a family that the community trusts and looks up to, that is well respected, and that also you build a trusting relationship with. And the reason for that, there's many of them. So one of them is that it helps you integrate. People are like, oh, if that family likes Anne, then maybe Anne isn't such a bad person after all, or maybe we can start to at least talk to her and see what she's about. But additionally, that family will tell you when you've messed up,
yeah.
and they will tell you how to negotiate the situation. I have two Bolivian families that I think of as brothers and sisters and moms and dads, and we call each other by those terms. And I
Wait a minute, that's interesting.
appreciate them.
So,
Yes,
sorry to interrupt, but
sure.
just because that was a very interesting point. So they allow you, at least I would imagine, in certain circumstances and cases, to use the kin terminology.
We use kin terms with each other. It's something that's happened over the years, and not all families will have this. So even if you're living with a family, or you're very close to a family in a community, you may not get to this level. You're just really good friends. But sometimes you will actually see things kind of slide into kinship terms. And and that can be really nice. It can be complicated, right? As soon as you're kind of part of someone else's family, there's additional considerations, which we can talk about now or later.
And perhaps
Um,
responsibilities as well, right?
Responsibilities are key.
Yeah.
But what's nice is that when you have someone who you are basically like family with, this family will tell it to you straight. And so if you have messed up, someone will tell you from your family, and that can be really helpful. So having a well-respected family you're connected with can help you integrate with the community, learn about the community in a casual setting. You're just spending time together, and things come up, and you can ask questions, and it's kind of casual, a casual situation, which is nice. And then additionally, they will tell you if you've done something wrong, and maybe how to fix it if you're lucky.
Could you try to connect to someone? Of course, they should also have their own family, but could you just try to connect to someone who is very high authority?
You could, and here's where the social skills come in again. So being able to kind of read the room in terms of whether the person in authority is a well-respected person or not. It helps to kind of take a pause as an anthropologist or as a field researcher and not just immediately say, I want to be connected to this family when you come into a community. Sometimes you might not have a choice. Maybe they're the only ones you know. It's hard to get into that community. There's low trust, maybe for good reasons. In Bolivia, there's low trust because of US involvement in the past with a variety of things, including their elections. And so if you may be limited. You may just have to work with a family that you encounter, and that's that. It helps, though, if you have a little more information before you become very close to one particular family. It could be the family is not that well respected. Even if they're in power, it may be that people don't like what they're doing, and so they're not very popular as a leader. It could also be that they, as leaders, sometimes have ulterior motives. So you may run into leaders who want to get a little extra resources out of the relationship and might not share with community members. Yeah. So that can be a problem. Yeah. So again, not to make this sound like it's impossible. I mean, if you're working in a city in your own country, you might not run into things like this, right? But if you're working in a place where you don't know anybody or very few people, you have to learn some of this as you go. And so this is, again, why participant observation, or as sometimes it's called, deep hanging out, right? Where you're there and you're not doing research, you're just trying to learn everything you can over the first week or two in a community. You can learn a lot about who's respected, who's not, political things you should know about, and that can help you decide who you want to really kind of be close friends with and whether that's going to be an asset or a problem.
Mm-hmm. By the way, when anthropologists go and do field work, do they usually go alone, or do they go like 2-3 people, or how does it work?
It varies a lot.
Okay.
So in cultural anthropology, there's a tradition of doing it by yourself. I don't necessarily espouse that tradition, but it's something that has been pretty common. Again, that can be helpful because in terms of integration, there's only one of you, and you also are only interacting with community members all day. There's nobody else. And so it really helps you integrate very quickly.
Also, because I would imagine that in certain cases, the other people, if you're there with 2 or 3 other people, the other ones might get suspicious sometimes.
Yeah, it kind of reinforces difference. So again, if you're doing research in a community that is not your own, and you, especially if there's a power difference. So if you, for example, are from a high-income country working in a low-income country, or from the city working in an urban place, or an urban place working in a rural place, for example, or if you are white working in a community of color, and there's multiple of you coming together, what happens is that difference is just reinforced. And it's reinforced for you too. So it can be good for mental health and that the culture shock can be lessened, but it may mean that you integrate less, and so you learn less. And so you're still not quite asking the right questions or getting the information you think you're getting. So there are pros and cons, but you will see, for example, some evolutionary anthropologists going to the field in teams, and that's very normal. And you can accomplish a lot with a team. But you can also, as an individual researcher, it's a very different experience. You can learn a lot being by yourself. So there are pros and cons, but you see both.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps tell us a little bit more about how you go about hanging out with people from the community and building relationships there. I mean,
sure.
Of course, it should work a little bit differently for different communities, but how do you go about interacting with them? In what kinds of activities do you try to participate in with them, and that kind of thing?
So, as I mentioned, this is sometimes called hanging out or deep hanging out. Basically, what you want to do as a field researcher is to slow down. So in many field contexts, especially if you are going from a country in Western Europe or in North America, and you are going to work in a country where things are slower paced, the first thing you have to do is just to slow down as best you can. Now, this isn't true for everyone in those countries, I should mention. Even paces of life in the US vary across different communities. For me, I was raised in a community where it's very go, go, go. And I'm also a very energetic person, and I just like to go and do things. So what I have to do, for example, when I go to Bolivia is just to really focus on being slow and taking things slowly. And there are multiple reasons for that. So one, of course, you can learn things better if you're slow. Two, a lot of times things are slow. So if you're waiting for that permit, or if you're waiting for a meeting with a leader, you might not get it on the first day, right? So you have to wait. And then additionally, being slow is often what everyone expects. And so if you're fast, you're rude, right? So it's nice to just kind of, first thing to do as you're coming in, just really slow yourself down, pay attention, and if for you, like me, that's hard, it may just involve a little bit of almost meditation, right? Just a little bit of just kind of letting yourself zone out, think about different things, just be patient, listen when you can, and wait, right? So slow down, step one. So then additionally, what are you going to do as you're doing this slowing down? Different anthropologists, different field researchers use different tactics. So some will, if they're trying to learn about foraging, for example, they might offer to help prepare food or offer to help in the fields. People might say no, and that's okay. What we have to remember is, again, we don't know what we're doing, and so we slow people down. So it's okay if they say no. But what you can do is find small ways to be useful. Maybe you're doing the dishes, right? Or maybe you are helping a little bit with childcare, but just some way that you're actually being helpful and getting a chance to spend time with people and learn about their daily lives. For researchers like me who are really interested in things like cooperation or how people make leadership work, sometimes just finding a way to hang out with leaders or to hang out at a community meeting can give you a lot of information. So if you're doing the full, very classic anthropology, you might try to learn everything about a community. Most of the time, we don't have multiple years to do that, right? And so what we do instead is focus on the area we're interested in. So again, if you're the person who's interested in child development and child rearing, you should find a way to spend time with kids, right? And to do that kind of hanging out. And again, you might be not collecting data in the first few weeks. If you're like me, that's hard, right? It's hard to take that slow down, but it can help people build trust in you. And you can also spend a lot of that time learning about what it's like to be there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I guess that at least some of this information could be useful not only for anthropologists and field workers, but also for people in general, because even if you go just to another country, even if you live in Portugal and you go to Spain, there are perhaps some particularities in the way you interact with people, in the way you establish relationships, if you should be on time or late or a little bit before the hour, or if you should speak loud or not, if you should share particular things about yourself with people or not, that perhaps people should keep in mind, at least in the early stages of their being integrated into a new country or a new community, because other people might find it weird and then not trust you, right?
Yeah, and everyone probably knows someplace they've been or in their own community when tourists come and it just doesn't quite match up, and you're wondering why they're doing this thing when everyone else here is doing that thing.
Yeah.
And what we can do as people, I guess in general, especially if you're curious about humans, is to just try to observe as best you can, right? And sometimes that means talking a little bit less or being a little bit less focused on yourself and your own relationships or whatever's happening. Say if you're traveling in a group, but you're traveling, and paying attention to what other people are doing. Now, we can be tempted based on one or two interactions to say, the Portuguese are like this or the Spanish are like that, right? And that's often not the case. We also come in with biases and preconceptions about how people are. We have to really look at what people are really doing and to try to set those biases aside as best we can, right? So making assumptions like this place is loud, people from here are loud. take a step back. What are they talking about? What are people doing? Are they on time or are they late, as you say, right? So
Yeah.
I think being observant is something that we can all cultivate, even if we're not field researchers, to your point. And even if we vary in how outgoing we are, how extroverted we are, we can still be observant, even if we're not, say, a people person.
Yeah. Yeah, also because if you're trying to integrate, it doesn't matter at all what you think is right or wrong many times. I mean, if you think that people should always arrive on time, but if you move into a community where they're always late, then they might start being suspicious of you because, oh my God, that guy always arrives on time. What is he doing? Or something like that, right?
Or you still don't know what you're doing and people are still wondering why doesn't hasn't Anne figured it out? Or for me, I'm wasting my time, right? Because I'm showing up at 5 o'clock for a meeting that everyone knows won't start till 7, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, being attuned to that can be a time saver. It makes you maybe look less foolish, to your point. And everyone increasingly can be on the same page. The more you integrate, the more you understand, and the more people trust you, to your point as well, right? So paying attention and trying to emulate can be important. There are limits to that, which we can talk about now or later if you wish, but some of those limits for people may include whether or not you're willing to actually abide by some of the norms there, particularly things like gender norms or expectations for different social classes. If you're working in countries that have a history of big class differences,
Yeah.
that can be something you run into, and maybe not all anthropologists actually, or field workers in general, actually want to meet those norms. And so that's a decision we also have to make.
By the way, since you mentioned basically stratified societies, okay, so this is perhaps a sensitive question, but
Sure.
a delicate question. But let me see if I can phrase it correctly. So I would imagine that at least when it comes to certain communities, uh, you being white
Yeah,
might play into some power dynamics there, right? Because
absolutely.
people who are part of that community already have that idea that people with a certain skin color are sort of higher status or in some ways superior to them, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So can that also be a complication in the way you establish relationships with those people?
Yeah. It's an important complication, and it goes in both directions. If you're, if you identify as a person of color, if you come from a community of color and you're working in a white community, you feel that too in a different way, and it changes how people interact with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so skin color, privilege in general. So skin color is usually being used as, not always, but usually being used as a marker of privilege. It can also be used overtly in racist ideas, right? Going one way or the other.
Yeah.
These things can really play in. So power dynamics are one of the interesting things that enter as a researcher. Now, this is one of the reasons why, for example, we support, anthropologists in general support folks actually doing anthropology in their own communities, not because it erases difference. A lot of times folks who are from those communities who leave and get an education, come back, are treated differently, and that can affect their relationships with people. But because of the kind of inherent colonialism that's somewhat baked into the way we've done anthropology in the past, where it's been predominantly white people trained in Western Europe and the United States and Canada to then go to other parts of the world and conduct research and then bring that information back, and then we're all very excited, like, look at how different it is, right? Look at this information we've gotten, but it doesn't necessarily benefit that community. So those things are very much the case in my work as well. So working in Bolivia and being white, a gringa, as I alluded to, right? So being white and from the US. It changes power dynamics, it changes expectations, and it means that it's something for anthropologists to negotiate, whatever the source of their difference from a community. So if it's a difference of privilege, where you either are or are perceived as having more privilege, maybe more money, or being from a more privileged class of people, what that means is that you may negotiate situations where people don't trust you, or where people have expectations about your resources that aren't true. Or that are true and make you uncomfortable. And so researchers deal with that in different ways. They may work on that by actually addressing it head on, by talking about it, by laughing about it, encouraging ideas. Sometimes they'll do this, like, oh yeah, I'm totally a gringa. Like, what do you think? What are gringos like? And starting to have that conversation where you can actually like laugh about it a little bit, address some of the power differentials that are there. It doesn't mean that they go away, but at least you're talking about it. And then also deciding what you are going to do about money, if that is something that happens, where folks might ask you for a loan or a favor, because you either do have more money or people assume you do, because of where you come from or who you are. And that's something for researchers to think about as they're going into the field. Are they willing to give gifts? How much? To whom? Are they willing to make loans? What kind of gift are they going to give to the community? How are they going to give back to communities for staying there? It may sound like this makes things transactional, but not necessarily. In a lot of cultures, because of gift giving and because of sharing back is something that is completely normal and expected. So it's a complicated question with a complicated answer. I hope I gave you some ideas on how we address that.
Yes, I was perhaps thinking specifically in terms of places where there's a colonial history associated with them. Like, I mean, since we're talking about stratified societies, I guess that extremely clear example would be India, where they have the
Yes,
caste
right.
system, which supposedly has been abolished, but socially it still operates there. And I mean, of course, you have the Indian people that are part of that caste system, and I would imagine that white people would not be included there, but they would look to them as usually people who are higher status just because they're white and because of the history, the colonial history with the English people, the British associated with them, right? And so that would also, in that particular case, if you're studying Indian communities, would probably have some sort of impact. Even I would imagine sometimes people would change their behavior somewhat just
Absolutely.
because they are in front of someone who they think is higher status and perhaps they should respect more or be more deferential or something like that. Right.
I will say that regardless of who's doing the studying, people usually do change their behavior when they're being studied. And the degree to which that happens does depend on status, to your point. I can't speak as directly to India, but I can speak to
Yeah, I mean,
Bolivia,
that was
for
just
example.
one
No, I know what
example
you
of a
mean.
stratified society that came to mind. So,
Yeah, well, I know what you mean, and so for Bolivia, for example, it is a stratified society. It's stratified in slightly different ways over time, but there is definitely still class, and class is still a huge thing in Bolivia. And there are also ideas about, for example, again, folks who are white, because of U.S. involvement and being from the U.S., for me, in these countries often leads to a lot of expectations, both positive and negative. So this kind of comes back to the idea of reflexivity. So this idea that when we're collecting data, one thing that field workers can do is to acknowledge who they are when they actually write about that data. Now, many of us who are doing scientific anthropology don't regularly incorporate this in the work we do. Folks who do cultural anthropology, who are writing up ethnography, will often include this, like, who am I and how does that potentially affect what people tell me or how they're reacting to me and so forth. So it's something to keep in mind. And if you're, for example, doing scientific field research, It's something to keep in mind about how people are responding to you, whether you or not you include it in the articles that you write later, your journal articles or your books about the work you've done, is a different question. But it is something that should affect the methods you do. Now, I'll give you a case example. So in Bolivia, I adopted what's called the MacArthur ladder. It's called various things, but in the US, what it's used for is kind of getting a sense of how people feel they're doing relative to other people, their kind of perceived socioeconomic status or their perceived class. And so it's a ladder with 10 different steps, and people can point to where they fall on that ladder. Now, maybe you see where I'm going with this, but if you have a white researcher in Bolivia who's asking people where they fall on the ladder, and you look at the distribution of people's responses to this question, very, very many people, the majority, said that they were on the bottom rung of the ladder when talking to me. And this is even though they varied, when I asked about their household incomes, varied quite a bit. Some households had quite higher incomes than other people did that I was interviewing. And even then they would say that they were at the bottom of the ladder. What's going on there? They're talking to a researcher from the United States, and she's asking them where they fall. And so even though I'm asking about where they fall relative to their community, they're looking at me. And so what this taught me as a researcher, and this is just one example, is that's not the kind of question that's going to work for me. Maybe I can have a research assistant ask that question, or maybe I should design it differently. But the way that people interact with me, the kinds of information that they give me, is always going to be affected by who I am. And that should change the way I go about doing research to make sure I'm actually getting data that reflects reality.
Yeah. And of course, in my interviews, I don't like to get too political. I prefer to stick to the science. But I mean, I guess that there are still some interesting observations that you can make in these situations, like, for example, the impact that racism might have in certain communities, or if not racism directly, at least some sort of stigma coming from their colonial history. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and of course, recognizing that race, the kind of races that we recognize, differ in different countries. So if I'm working in Bolivia, there are different ideas about race and who is at the top and who is at the bottom than in other places. And for some researchers who, for example, are researchers of color, when they move between different countries, their position in hierarchies shifts because of what one country expects versus another. And so that plays in a lot. And it's something that can enter in repeatedly in different ways in different contexts. And a lot of it does have to do with colonial history and also with current government policy in those countries.
Yeah, I mean, even here in Portugal, generally I think that those are words that people in Brazil use more than we here in Portugal. But there are specific terms to people who have sort of had children with indigenous people, with black people. Like you've probably heard some of these, like mestiço in Portuguese, that in Spanish would be mestizo.
It's the same.
I mean, mulato, also something like that. So I mean, yeah, those are clear markers of people distinguishing themselves socially due to certain, let's say, political, economic, and social structures that were in place during colonial history.
Exactly. And mestizo or mestizaje is also something that appears in Spanish, as you know. And the position of folks who are, just taking this one example, mestizo or identify as mestizo, has shifted over time. Sometimes higher status, sometimes lower status, depends on the country. It's different to be mestizo in Bolivia than it is in Mexico, for example. And so, yeah, those differences are there, and they're there in slightly different ways in different countries, and you'll run into them regardless of who you are and how you look. You will run into them in one way or another, and you will be slotted into different parts of the hierarchy, and that will change the way people interact with you, not only participants, but leaders or officials who are deciding whether or not you have access to the country, or if you're working with the local university, who is at the university and who is not. You'll run into things like that all the time.
And since we're talking about politics, what if you get into the community in a particular point in time where they're having some sort of political issue there? So how would you, or how should you deal with it as a researcher?
Yeah. So this is where observational powers again come into play. So you may not know when you first come to a community and ask for permission or to do research, or if you're talking about your research, you may not know what the politics are. Someone may be nice and tell you. So you may know someone who's lived in that community or an official from somewhere else who's warned you, but you may not have any idea. And so one of the things to do is to just try to be observant. So if you're at a community meeting, who's fighting? Like, what's going on? Why is this happening? What are they fighting over? If you have a family you're really well connected to, maybe they will tell you. But sometimes you just won't know. This has happened to me. So, for example, I was working in a community. I got permission from the community itself to do the research, went to a community meeting, talked about what I was up to. And then it ended up that there were a group of people who were trying to start their own community, who were trying to break away and create their own community. And I hadn't asked them for permission. And it's because I didn't know they existed. And the only way I found out about this is that I went to a house and asked if someone would be interested in doing an interview. And they were mad, right? And they told me why. And then I realized that I'd done something inadvertently, right? I didn't even know it was there. So how did I deal with it then? I went back to trusted people that I knew, that I was friends with, and I asked them about the backstory, who was disagreeing with whom, what was it over. Then I came back to the community that was trying to break away, and I said, can I talk to you all about my research? Can we do this? So sometimes you'll run into politics without knowing it's there. You will also, of course, run into national politics, and this kind of comes back to our conversation about ethics, and I'll talk about gender here as well. So you are working often in a different country. Again, you may not be, but even if you're in the same country, for example, if I work in certain communities in the United States, they have their own politics, and they also have their own politics in relation to national politics, right? So what's happening in one community and what's happening at the national level might be extremely different. And so I may run into that politics working within my country or internationally. And the question is, what do I do with that information, if anything? So, for example, if I'm in Bolivia, do I engage with Bolivian national politics? Do I have an opinion about it if someone asks me, right? Do I have an opinion about U.S. politics? Again, knowing that the U.S. and Bolivia have had kind of a fraught relationship in the past, have had a difficult relationship. So that's a question for me as a researcher. And here, again, we can get into the question of gender, because you might be working in a place that has very different gender norms. So I, as a woman, for example, if I'm working in East Africa, so my postdoc, Chris Smith, works in East Africa, for example, and my collaborator, Monique Borger-Hofmulder, in some communities you would wear the hijab. And are you willing to do that as a researcher? Are you willing to cover? Some people aren't, right? Some are. And so this question of politics and local norms and expectations can all kind of come into our decisions as researchers. How is that going to affect us, for one, in ways we may not realize when we come in? We should always ask the trusted people if we can, and figure out if there's politics we've accidentally made a mistake that we should know about, or who we need to talk to make sure that we aren't just on one side or the other side of some kind of political division. But then additionally, with respect to national politics, or with respect to religious norms or local ways of doing things, do we have an opinion, right? Do we feel that a line has been crossed and we must say something as a researcher, we should take a stand? Or do we stay quiet and observe and become part of that society as best we can? Do we wear the hijab, for example?
But by the way, you taking a stand here, would it be just in the interest of science? I mean, in a way of integrating into the community and being able to collect the data and study people and so on, or also a moral issue that you should have a take on it or not, and should
Yeah.
do something about it or not?
The moral issue is more. I'll start with the moral, but it's usually the first concern, and then I'll talk about scientific implications after.
Okay.
So some researchers will, for example, take a stand about gender norms that they feel are unfair, right? And they're unwilling to abide by those norms. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but just a statement of fact, right? Additionally, you might have researchers who are really integrated with a community, collaborating with them, and that community really wants something, or something happens to that community. The researcher might take a stand as an advocate or work alongside community members in advocacy. So, for example, when it comes to land rights or resource rights, you sometimes see researchers working with communities to actually get land rights. My colleague Steve Lansing has been working on this, for example. And so you'll see researchers get involved and they feel that this is important. It's important to the community, or it's important to them as a person to actually, as I said, make a stand to say that this is what we must do, or this is what I'm going to do to try to set an example. Now, if you do actually take a stand, sometimes, again, helping the community, right? Or sometimes saying that I disagree with this treatment of women, or I disagree with these national level politics, I think this is not right. That will have an effect, positive or negative, right? It's not just one thing. It's often there's good and bad effects in terms of the science.
Yeah.
So for the science, it may affect the data you're collecting. Again, whether that's, makes the data better or worse. It may affect your ability to stay in a community, or your ability to get a permit to enter the country, right? If you've made someone angry. There are consequences for taking a stand. And again, a lot of researchers still decide to do it, right? If something really matters to them or to the community that they're collaborating with, especially if they're a member of that community working as an advocate. But it is something that we have to think about as researchers. What are we going to stand up for, if we stand up, and why? And at what times are we going to kind of just play by the local rules, for better or worse?
But when it comes to the morality or ethics side of things here, so of course you have those issues, those political, social issues you might want to participate in because you have a set of values or whatever, but then without sounding too relativistic here, or espousing moral or cultural relativism too much here. I mean, of course, this is probably more of a philosophical / ethical question than a scientific one, but should you be careful in the interest of science about how much you interfere in the society you're studying in? How much you interfere with their norms, their practices, their rituals, whatever, because that might mess up the scientific data you're collecting. You know what you understand what I'm asking.
What you mean. So I sometimes tell my students when we're talking about this in my grad class that ethics is a journey. Because there are no right and wrong answers, and the ideas you have about what is appropriate and what isn't will change over time. It will depend on the community and on the circumstances. And there is the question of what kind of effects will it have on the science and on the data.
Yeah.
So a lot of folks now will say it is not ethical to not do something when you encounter something in the community. I'll just think of some examples from Bolivia. So as you become more integrated to community sometimes, or even if you're not integrated yet, but people see you as someone they can trust, they will often confide in you. They will tell you things they wouldn't tell other people because you're an outsider and you're gonna probably not gossip as much as other people would, especially in those small communities, right? And so people will come with you and tell you things that you did not expect to necessarily hear. So things about mental health. I've had folks come to me and talk about depression that they're struggling with. domestic violence or domestic disputes, and actually, coming to me and saying that this is happening with this person in the household, and a couple is splitting, or these kinds of things come up. And the question is, even at the small level, we'll start here. What do you do? So what do you do when someone comes to you and says that they're depressed? Or what do you do when someone comes to you and says that they're in a situation that is violent in their household? And as a researcher, right, I think that my responsibility then is to put that person in contact with someone who can help them as best I can. And if you're working in a rural place, wherever that rural place is, you often don't have those resources, right, as well as you would in other places. But I then do what I can to bring resources back. Maybe it's a packet. I mean, that doesn't sound like much, but a packet of information, or a phone number, a national phone number that someone can call. And so will that change my relationship with that person? Potentially, right? It might change the way that they answer some questions if I come by with a survey. But I feel like I want to do something because I'm the conduit, right? I am the person who is coming from somewhere else and has that information, and I want to share it. Now, if I take a stand about something to do with gender rights because of domestic violence that people are experiencing, will that change my relationship with the community and the data I get? Yes. Should I be concerned about that as a scientist? This depends on the scientist, right? So again, that reflexivity can help if someone does decide to take that road and to make that stand about just telling the reader when you're writing up, I've been involved in this and this in the community. I took a stand for women's rights that may affect some of the interviews I have with men in the community. You can say that. And that gives us a little bit of caveat to go with that. The one thing I will say in defense of doing the science and doing the thing that researchers think is ethical here, and sometimes standing up for people or getting involved in a way that supports them, is that all science always has a little bit of bias or noise in the data, right? There's always something entering in. If you're doing mouse studies, there's one mouse that's got a little bit of a different personality than the other mice or something like that, right? So it's always going to be a little messy here and there. But as a human working with humans, it's hard not to get involved. And there are implications for that. But taking a step back and documenting it and being open about it, I think, as we're talking about our work, can be helpful when it comes to understanding the science.
Yeah, and not only that, and if you don't agree with what I'm going to say now, please tell me, but I think that people having this sort of idea that science is absolutely objective and value-free is also sort of silly, because just thinking about, okay, so you are in a community and you see some sort of unethical thing happening there, and you struggle between putting the science or your ethical values on top of one another or something like that. I mean, if you choose the science, it's still a value, right? Because you're valuing science above human rights, for example, or whatever you want to call it. So, I mean, to do science, you also have to have certain values set in place and put them above others, right?
Yeah, that's 100% true. It's, as you know, it's probably, as you probably know, and many others watching and listening will know, that this is definitely part of the conversation right now when it comes to doing science. Science is not value free. It does reflect as well the scientists who are doing it. And part of what I was referring to earlier with increasing the diversity of field researchers is partially because you ask different questions if you have a different background, right? You look in different places for answers. And taking, as you said, just to really, I want to underscore what you said, not doing something is a decision. I'm not sure, again, how it is in Portugal, but in the US, you probably know, and many others will as well, is that if you present someone with the trolley problem, right, the trolley is going down the track and you have one person it will hit if you take no action, or sorry, 5 people it'll hit if you take no action, but if you divert it, it'll kill one person, do you pull
Or
the
you can,
lever?
or you can push a very fat person.
Right, exactly. All the different versions of the trolley problem. Taking no action is still a decision,
Yeah.
right? And so even though folks who were born and raised in the US will often feel like, don't intervene, and that can become part of the science that we do, right? Don't intervene, that is still a decision. And it still affects the science one way or the other, no matter what. So I agree with you. There's no such thing as completely objective science.
Yeah. So getting back to the to the field, I guess.
Yeah.
Uh, how do you learn then the social norms in a particular
Yeah.
community? Yeah, because I would imagine that's one of the most basic things if you want to live there, if you want to survive there, even, right?
Yeah. Live there, survive there, not have as horrible of a culture shock as you might have otherwise. Learning the norms is a lot of just kind of a quick recap of what we've talked about before. So be willing to be wrong and made fun of, but you're still there. You're still being part of things. You can learn a lot that way. Ask questions, but not too many. Be observant as best you can. So even though it's not possible to get rid of all of our biases, to try to really see things as they are.
Yeah.
And to be ready to apologize as appropriate. It's not appropriate to apologize in all places. In Bolivia, if I'm profusely apologetic, people will wonder what's wrong with me, right? But to apologize as appropriate and make amends when you make a mistake, these are all ways that you can kind of figure out what the norm system is. And I said this earlier in my response just a minute ago, but I want to say it again. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have friends or people who consider you family or someone in the community who will tell you when you've messed up. Because a lot of times you won't know otherwise. But that's key. Messing up is key. I mean, you learn what the norms are that way, and what the rules are. So humility is one of the take-home messages from today about how to do field research.
Yeah. Well, because I also like to do things as quick as possible. If I got to any particular community and they have someone like a shaman there, I would
Mhm.
probably go directly to him and try to be friends with him because he would probably tell me all about the social norms and the rituals and when to apologize and when not to apologize and yeah.
Mhm.
So, but that's just me. I'm usually very straightforward, but that probably doesn't work every time. So,
Doesn't work everywhere. Yeah, even if we're very straightforward people, or if we're people who like to get at things in a roundabout way, that doesn't mean that it works everywhere, to your point. And talking to the shaman also isn't your best bet in all situations. It depends on
yeah, I
how
imagine.
well respected they are, whether on the fringe of the community. But yeah, figuring out pretty quickly, like, who am I going to go talk to? Who's going to help me out? There are actually whole books written on this. So another one I want to mention here is The Essentials of Field Relationships by Collar and Barris. So this is a 2010 book. We'll also walk you through who to talk to and when to beware of someone who might actually be hoping to use you. So be careful about that. But yes, figure out who can tell you what the norms are and when you've messed up.
Yeah. So, okay, one last topic then, and this is perhaps a delicate one. Not that the other ones aren't, because I guess that all of them are, but what about uh, personal complications that might
Yeah.
arise on the field? Because I mean, of course, you establish these relationships with people, they might consider you friends, family, whatever, and that also in our own societies comes usually with some complications that in the case of a scientist, of a researcher, might get in the way of doing their own research, right?
Yep, social relationships are complicated, and it is a bit of a continuation of what we've been talking about a little bit before in terms of how do you manage these things.
Yeah.
So Exactly as you said. So as you're becoming part of any community, you become a friend, a neighbor, maybe a family member. People start calling you sister or brother, or maybe, and we can talk about this a bit more, you choose to become someone's godparent. In Catholic countries like Bolivia, you might be invited to be a godparent.
Oh, that
And what
that
does
might
that mean?
might
Yeah.
also happen. Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Sorry, you could finish your thought. That might also happen where?
No, I was just reacting to what you were saying, that you might also become a godparent to someone in some
Hmm.
community.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, because I hadn't thought about it, so I just found it
Oh
interesting.
yeah. No, it's these little relationships you wouldn't think too much about, or maybe you would in the US, for example, or in Portugal, or wherever you happen to live right now, if you're listening, but you take it for granted. You have the knowledge about what is involved in those relationships. So here you are in a community. You may be a member of that community. And the question is, what are your relationships going to be like now? So maybe you already have friends there, or you already have family there, and they now look at you as a researcher, and you're like, they don't trust me. What's changing here? The dynamics have shifted. Or you're an outsider who's integrating to that community, and then now you have friendship relationships, but maybe the expectations of friends in Bolivia are not the same as the expectations of friends in the US.
Mhm.
So you're entering into these relationships that often happens naturally, right? Especially with friendships. And then the question is, do you count as a Bolivian friend? Can you be asked for loans? We talked about this before with
Mhm.
respect to privilege and resources. Can you be asked to babysit? Can you be asked to help sponsor a party? Right? What are your obligations and what is involved? So again, the more you know about a community, you know more about what you're agreeing to. But friendship happens naturally, right? You don't suddenly get asked to go study with a friend usually, right? To
Uh,
be in a relationship with them.
and I mean, you're a researcher, but you're still a human, right?
You're still a human. And I won't speak for all researchers, but I often feel like Bolivia is my second home, right? I
Mm.
feel comfortable there. I've spent a year and a half total in Bolivia across multiple trips. It's been a while now because of COVID, and I have a
Yeah.
small child, so it hasn't been easy to travel. But, you know, I feel like Bolivia is my friends and family, just as I do here. The dynamics are certainly different, but I still feel quite close to people. And so how do we negotiate those relationships? How do we do that? So, for example, one time where you actually are asked to be in a relationship with someone in a community is, for example, if you're asked to be a godparent. So someone approaches you and says, will you be a godparent for my child? And for this event, maybe it's a baptism or maybe it is their graduation, but you're asked. Do you say yes? Right? So I have colleagues who say no, you shouldn't say yes to that, and others who say yes. And here are some pros and cons. So if you're in a godparent relationship, like in Bolivia, for example, you are closer than a friend. You can be asked for additional help, right? Would you be willing, for example, to sponsor that child? So if you're even in the same country, say working in rural Bolivia, but you live in the capital city, would you be willing for that child to come stay with you while they're looking for universities or
Yeah,
while they're looking for a job?
yeah, because I was going to ask, being a godparent, doesn't that, in that specific society, entail some lifelong obligations?
Commitments. It does, especially if you're, say, a baptismal godparent, right? Because then you are supposed to also be, say, a spiritual guide for this child.
Hmm.
And so the question then becomes, do you say yes, right? And if you say yes, you're entering into these obligations. So a question for a researcher to reflect on might be, how long do you plan to continue your relationship with this community? Do you plan to come back? Are you comfortable with some of these obligations that you may be called up for support in certain times, or maybe involved in some family decisions here and there? Maybe you, at minimum, should bring a gift for your godchild when you come back to the community. Um, and then on some of the more pro sides, thinking about why you might want to do this, of course, you build relationships with people. That feels great. And it's nice to have a second community. But additionally, you also learn a lot about the institution. So I have a paper under revision right now with one of my former grad students on godparent relationships. And I learned about them from being a godparent. All the expectations became very clear to me as I entered into that relationship. So sometimes for anthropologists or field researchers who aren't from a community, being given a relationship, being a son or daughter, being a godparent means you actually learn about the obligations. So if you're like me studying cooperation, you learn a lot about cooperation by partaking in it.
Yeah. Also, because I would I'm not sure, but I would imagine that being a godparent in those circumstances, I mean, if you as an anthropologist just end your field work, go away and never again contact those people, then that
Yeah,
might have some social complications for them, right? I mean,
it does.
having a godparent that is not available, right?
Not part of the picture. I mean, if that child, for example, if it is a spiritual thing, we didn't even get into religion here, whether one chooses or not to go to religious services, if one is of one religion going to another or is not religious. If you're expected to be a guide for that child and you're not around, what is that like? Now, for me, for example, I have a godson from a baptism, and so for Ugo, for my godson, it means that we do things over WhatsApp, right? And we're able to do that, but I'm not there. And that's different. And I actually had that conversation with his parents when they asked me. As I said, look, I'm gonna come and go. I'm not always gonna be here. Is that something you're comfortable with? To have that kind of frank conversation with them. And they said yes, that they still really wanted to go forward if I was okay with it. So that's something to keep in mind as when you have a choice in these relationships, when you're making that decision, what are you going to do? But with those friendships, as you said, you fall into it naturally. We're all human. What does it mean to be a friend in that context? You learn a lot from doing it, but it also means that you have to think about your obligations and what people expect of you. And sometimes that can be a little complicated.
Yeah, and another specific kind of relationship that we as humans are prone to, whether you're male or female, you might be more or less attractive to the opposite sex. So,
Mm.
I mean, do you also have that kind of complication as an anthropologist working on the field? Does that sometimes happen?
It does. It does. So anthropologists have fallen in love with and married folks at the field sites they're working with in the past. And again, these are anthropologists not from those communities. If you are from that community, of course, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, romantic entanglements happen. We're still human, as you said. We still are attracted to people, even if we are at work, right? So people fall in love with their coworkers, people fall in love at
Yeah.
fields, it happens, right? And so what do you do? Do you pursue that relationship? And there's some kind of complicated questions here. Of course, just like every relationship, it changes your relationship with the community. So if you're thinking about the science of it, or if you're thinking about your long-term ability to come back, which I will admit are both very me kind of considerations, then that's something to keep in mind, right? What kind of impacts will that have? And then additionally, something to think about includes, do you have plans to come back? How is this going to affect someone's life, their everyday life, not just yours? Because if you are romantically involved with someone, people will treat them differently. People will treat you differently too in that community, of course.
I would imagine that in some contexts it might be even more dramatic than being a godparent, right?
Definitely more dramatic. It can be positively viewed, so it can integrate you into a community further. And so there have been some people who have espoused it for that reason.
Uh-huh.
But it can also be complicated, which brings me to my last point here, which is that the power dynamics are still there. So one still needs to think about what power dynamics are at play and how does that impact the expectations of the two people who are in a potential relationship or even who are potentially having a one-night stand, right? How is power factoring into that? So there are a lot of things attached to that statement I just made, and I'll let everyone kind of think about all the various things you could say. That's a whole nother conversation. But it's something to think about when getting romantically involved with someone at a field site, particularly if it's not your community.
Yeah. So I guess that this would be a good question to end our conversation on. Why should people do field research then? Why not just be an armchair anthropologist
Right.
a theorist or something like that.
Yeah. So why do field research? And again, I want to remind everyone that field research can be as easy as working with someone in your community who identifies as the same group as you, right? That it can be as simple as that. You don't need to go a long distance away. Even then, as you heard, though, it's not always simple, right? There's always entanglements.
Yeah.
Why do it? Besides the fact that you're resigning yourself to having a smaller sample size than if you use Mechanical Turk or Prolific, right? Why do the field research? So just to kind of come back to the beginning of our conversation, if you are trying to understand humanity and understand human nature and human diversity, it helps to see it from, first of all, different perspectives. So working with different communities, not all will have the same, for example, in my area, the same perspectives on cooperation, who cooperative partners are. Are they family? Are they friends? Are they godparents? What's involved? How do we do it? How do we punish people? Knowing all of those things gives us kind of this richness and this understanding of how flexible humans are. Flexibility defines our species. And so to understand human flexibility, we have to be out there experiencing it and measuring it. And if we're working in our own communities, why do it? Well, a lot of the time it's to actually bring representation in the sciences for that community that hasn't previously been there. So understanding the psychology of that community, or understanding how they are raising children or producing food, things that haven't been studied before because we haven't had those voices in our scientific literature. So my pitch for it is that humans are very flexible. I think we're extremely interesting, and sometimes to really understand how flexible we are and how our minds work and why we do what we do, you actually need to be out there experiencing it yourself and learning about it before you can really understand how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I will just add, and this might sound a little bit silly for people who generally watch or listen to me because I'm very scientifically minded, but I've learned a lot, a huge lot from anthropologists, that's for sure. But I still think that the example I mentioned of me growing up in a small village in Portugal also predisposed me to understanding many things that anthropologists study much better than I would otherwise have understood it, probably. So.
Mm-hmm. You understand what it means to talk about small community dynamics and things like that. And as much of it, I'm a scientist and you're scientifically minded, right? As much as we are scientists, we always come with a background and we always come with ideas and experiences that will guide our research and will also, in some ways, help us understand other people too.
Yeah. Okay, so just before we go, you mentioned some books. I think you mentioned Bernard's research methods in anthropology and Kaler's and Barres's Essentials of Field Relationships. I don't think you mentioned Borger of Mulder's I've Been Gone Far Too Long. Right?
Yes. So Monique Bergerhoff Mulder and co-author Logsdon have this book that they compiled of stories from field anthropologists. So every chapter is a different story from a different place from 1996 called I've Been Gone Far Too Long. And this can be really helpful to just normalize the experience of doing field research in rural places where you are not from the community and how that plays out. It can be a bit therapeutic for folks who are experiencing culture shock or who have experienced it. So I recommend it for people who either want to know what it's really like to do that or who really just need to read experiences where someone else messed up and to know it's not just them.
Yeah. So I will try to be careful enough to leave the links to them, to all of them in the description of the interview. If I forget, please someone remind me and I will do it. Hit me with a hammer in the head and I will, because I mean, sometimes it's just too much work. And even though I try to be as thorough as I can with my description, sometimes I forget. So if I do, sorry about that, but yeah, check those books anyway. And Dr. Pisor, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. And it's always a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me back. It was fun to talk about all of these myriad topics. And if anyone has questions, they can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or by email as well. Just Google me. I'm the only one of me. You'll find me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.